is part and parcel of the amazingly generous and vital work that you do, Colin, in the outward-facing world. So without further ado, I recommend everybody get this wonderful book, and you'll hear why in just a minute. It's a great pleasure to give way to you, Colin.
All right. Thank you all for being here. I can't tell you, it's so cool to see a full room, so many friends, people from throughout my life. Thank you all for coming out. It means a lot to me. And I have to tell you, I did a reading a couple weeks ago in my hometown, Iowa City, which was really wonderful too. But the truth was, I think the average person in that room was about 85 years old. So it's wonderful to be someplace that just looks a little fresher. So thank you. And thanks, Peter. And thank you, Unbound. This is a tough, weird world, and I'm so grateful that I connected with you all. I feel like I'm in the right home for the kind of work that I do, and that you all have been wonderful, wonderful partners. So thank you. And thank you, Magers and Quinn. This is a great shop, and we're fortunate to have it. So we are here to share this book, The Discarded. And I want to just tell you a little bit about how it began. This is going to be sort of a recognizable story to some of you, because this is a story that's grounded in a bit of my own life, and it's part of my life I share with a bunch of you working at the Minneapolis Public Library. So roughly 20 years ago, when I did work there, and again, with some of you in that world, I had two kind of strange discoveries. One was, this was in the old library before the new beautiful building. No, I think it's kind of the same there as well. A discovery working there was that when you go down into the basement, there is a second library. There is a very, very large discard room. I'm talking, at least the size of this entire bookstore, where all of these books are being purged out of the library, and they sit there, often for a very long time. And this I had no idea that existed. It was a mystery, a surprise to me to find it. But it wasn't really a hard to explain mystery. I didn't know, but once someone explained, yeah, of course, you have to make room for new books and you got to put them somewhere. It made a lot of sense. What was really more surprising to me was my own reaction to it. I was working in an incredible library, a 1 million book collection, and that when I had free time, when I could go wander the library, I didn't. I found myself really drawn to the discard room. It was, for me, a more fascinating place, a more relaxing, more soothing, more exciting place to wander than the library itself. And that's been a little bit of a mystery to me for a long time, why that space was so much more interesting to me than the library. And so I've been thinking about discarded books and why some of them are so wonderful for a long time. And that finally took a long time, took about 20 years, as I said, to germinate into a book, but that's kind of the heart and soul of this. So I wanted to start with a section from the introduction. So it's a book told by a librarian who has the sort of unglamorous job of managing the discard room. Obviously that's not the prestige job in the library, but it's his. And this is the setup for the book. So I'm just gonna skip in a little bit. And here's that librarian talking essentially about his discovery of the discard room and what it looks like to him. As a library aide, I spent the majority of my days working on varied research assignments and restocking the shelves, one of the monotonous but unautomated tasks in this highly mechanized building. Picking up a cart of books from the returns room, I might on any given day bend to the right, passing under giant suspended butterflies and ladybugs into the forested children's library, or I might press forward into the glittering shelves of new arrivals, from which I'd eventually drift on to the realm of general fiction and its offshoots, romance, crime, fantasy. It was a garden of forking paths, and I could end anywhere, from Soviet agricultural policy to the cargo cults of Melanesia. On some occasions, however, rather than returning to the collection, I would retrieve a cart from one of the division workrooms and wheel it to the service elevator, and then ride that down to the second basement. Both subterranean floors were entirely devoid of the high design elements that brought the library itself into such vibrant existence. These hallways were just wide enough for whatever trolleys and equipment had been deemed necessary to pass through them. And from the dents and scrapes along the wall, it was evident we'd either miscalculated or had hired people who hardly cared. The hallways remained dark and flickering despite the uncovered fluorescent bulbs that ran along the ceiling. The floors were bare, pockmarked concrete. What drew me down into the basement lay at the end of a dark hall behind a final set of double doors. It was a large, nondescript room filled with rows of old metal shelving that had been scavenged from the prior library. Everything gray and functional and pressed far closer together than any fire code would allow. When the new library first opened, this room was spotless and its shelves empty. But within months, it began to fill. And within a year or so, the shelves had become stacked haphazardly with books. Thousands or possibly tens of thousands of books. Some in horizontal piles, some slumped half vertically, some ready to tumble onto the floor, some already having tumbled onto the floor, all without order or design, simply massed. The chaos of this room was disorienting, especially coming from the proper library, although it retained a particularly bookish variety of chaos, silent and undisturbed. What unified these books was that they had all been stripped from the library's permanent collection and were now waiting to be sold at quarterly sales for 50 cents or $1, sometimes in anonymous brown bags with their tops rolled down and stapled, or shipped to Africa in vast containers, or recycled for pulp. Although rarely discussed publicly, an unavoidable reality of every library is that collections cannot simply grow and grow. Finite shelves fill, and at some point the past begins to crowd out the possibility of new works and discoveries. Thus, libraries weed, harvesting from their collections books that have been damaged or defaced, with missing pages or obscene drawings, with scribbled rhymes and insults crowding the margins, bestsellers that have been bought en masse to satisfy one season's demand, but that were largely forgotten just a few years later, or easily reduced to a half dozen copies, or one, books of economic data, scientific reports, medical advice, political analysis that were no longer accurate or relevant. Scattered among this refuse were also those books that had, for any number of reasons, despite holding a place on the shelves for years, occasionally even for decades, never managed to attract enough readers to justify their continued presence, and in some cases, no readers whatsoever, perhaps not a single one. Although thousands of people, songwriters and nurses, immigrants and small business owners, poets and researchers, book clubbers and soloists, long-distance truck drivers, inventors, the broken-hearted, the aggrieved, passed through the library every day, they all apparently passed up the opportunity to read The Least Coveted of Jewels, The Thorns of Reality, or The 13th Month. Which ended up in the discard. And of course, most of the books were dreadful. Poorly designed, garish in their covers, outlandish in their blurbs, pedantic in their dust jacket summaries, awkward in their opening paragraphs, clumsy in their characters, cliched in their final lines, stilted in their dialogue, ridiculous if not outright creepy in their sex. It's easy to understand why even those patrons who had deigned to handle them had, quickly, unceremoniously, with slight embarrassment, set them back down. But sometimes there'd be something else as well, a little glimmer of talent, of distinction, that might break through for a few pages before succumbing to the worst or the most predictable of writerly habits. And sometimes I really couldn't tell why one of these volumes had been banished while its peer had become a book club favorite. Many, despite their age, looked virtually new, with a clear, crisp stand to their spines, still glossy in their cellophane wraps, eagerly awaiting a reader. One afternoon, I started to pull a few of these books aside, 4 or 5 at first, and then a dozen or 2. Not finding any open space, I created some, sweeping the top shelf of a far rack clear. And on it, I began to assemble a second library, scavenged out of all of this waste. To begin, it was quite small, not even stretching from one vertical to the other. But each time I returned to the discard room, I'd excavate a few more discoveries, and my library would expand incrementally, a few inches at a time, until it must have comprised a couple hundred books. So that's the basic setup. A librarian is working in this great big discard room, and most of it is junk, most of it's kind of embarrassing and awful or just dated. But he starts to find things within it that aren't. And the story of the book, or the content of this book, is really, it's 20 different chapters, 20 stories, that are each essentially imaginary books that he pulls from the discard room, and then sort of tells the story of these books. And so when I was writing it, there was basically a couple challenges that I gave myself. I wanted to try and imagine books that if they had actually been written, they would definitely end up in the discard room. Like, there's just something ultimately wrong with them, and they would end up in the discard room. But at the same time, if they were in the discard room and you found them, you would just have to save them. That there's also something magical and worthwhile about them. So it's this very thin part of the Venn diagram where they're flawed and hopeless, but beautiful and worth saving. So that's what I was trying to find. And the other piece I wanted to do was to be as eclectic as a library itself. And so I didn't want to write 20 different novels. So you have graphic novels, you have histories, you have scientific treatises, you have technical manuals, you have books in translation, you have books of poetry. And so I was trying to just be as expansive as my imagination would let me be. So that's the setup. I kind of skipped to the first of the books, which is a book called Under the Raven, and it's a detective story. Let's see if we can go a little bit higher. Under the Raven, and it's a detective story by a Czech writer called Joseph Matusek. And so this is the beginning of that chapter. We are in a large, dark room, lit only by speckled columns of dusty, late afternoon light filtering down through the cellar windows. There is a buzz of people speaking softly, slowly, possibly to themselves. Cigarette smoke snakes around the silhouetted men and women, pushing down the hoppy smell of beer as it rises up from the floor. It's not an office, but a place where business of a certain kind can be done. A man, will follow him, sits alone. It would be easy to say he's seen better days, but has he? He's seen many days, that's for sure. But how many were actually good or simply better than this? When he concentrates, he can feel his heart beating in his earlobes and fingertips, each surge of blood elbowing through the accumulated debris of drink and meat and tar. A single cough triggers a fit, and soon enough he's half doubled over, his fist and sleeve wet with whatever had recently clogged his lungs. Yes, there must have been better ones. He searches his brain for them, but all that comes back are cliches that belong to the collective memory rather than his actual past. Fields of wheat in August, a wedding party, men singing with their arms around one another, children playing soccer. When he writes himself, a woman has taken the seat across from him. Her hair is dyed black and stands stiff, her nose an inverted Slavic arch, her face pale and inviting. Are you, she asks, Voyachek? What he is the type to indulge metaphysical questions, at least in the playground of his own mind. And so he immediately wonders, am I Voyachek? Or am I the one called Voyachek?
Yeah.
And what would it mean to be Voyachek? And just because I may have been Voyachek, what proof do I have that I continue to be Voyachek? Although his job is to solve things, to get to the truth, what gives him the most pleasure these days are unanswerable inquiries. So that's the start. You got a detective who probably drinks too much and is much more involved in questions that can't be answered than actually solving problems. But he's approached by this woman who needs his help. And her problem is that she's convinced she's dead. She's not sure how it happened. She might have been killed, she might have just died, she might have committed suicide. And she's come to this detective to try and help solve this mystery of her own demise. So they're an odd couple who aren't necessarily prepared to solve a whole lot. I'm going to skip forward a little bit and just pick up story midstream. And the way this is told, it's often, it's the librarian narrator kind of describing his books. So this is him talking about it. At times, Under the Raven reads like a relatively straightforward crime story, with Voyachek easily filling the archetype of a hard-boiled detective, and Ava, that's her name, a damsel in distress. But at various times it suggests instead a political thriller, a hero's journey, a middle-age romance, or a religious allegory. Voyachek follows clues, turns a cynical eye on the various suspects, and becomes entangled with the uninventive, literal-minded police. Soon it's revealed that Ava's ex-husband, a deceitful cad, is an ideologue for a clandestine nationalist movement. And though Voyachek stumbles upon a plot to sabotage the upcoming elections. But that plot line crumbles away as well. For all their practiced bluster, the aspiring fascists prove too incompetent to pull off more than a random street brawl, largely among themselves, which Wojciech narrowly escapes, winded and dizzy. He meets colleagues, ex-lovers, the regulars at her corner bar, her doctor, a childhood friend, each of whom offers a slightly different, incomplete, and often conflicting image of Eva. Her sister, a calligrapher transcribing Dante's Divine Comedy into an ideogram, insists Eva was always hysterical. Outside her studio, while rubbing another cigarette butt into the cobblestones with his leather heel, Wojciech eyes a street urchin, studying him from the shadow of an alley. Once she's captured his attention, she backs into a dark recess, and the chase is on. Although that may be a poor word for it. Only a child, the girl could outrun him at any time. It's less a case that he's chasing her than that she's luring him deeper into the city, through twisting streets, up fire escapes, down tenement hallways, beneath a bridge, through a bank, through a brothel, an art gallery. Each time he nearly loses her, she waits, and he gets some glimpse of her face, a moment of partial recognition. As she turns at the top of a subway entrance, he starts to wonder if the girl might be Ava's child. As though she'd been waiting for him to put the clues together, she catches his eye and then disappears. On a high floor of a dilapidated socialist housing project, he finds Ava's mother in an apartment utterly devoid of personal effects. No photographs, no books, no knitted pillows or mismatched mugs. Her house slippers look virtually unworn. When they talk about Ava, he thinks she might cry, but she never does. Wedged into the frame of a mirror by the door, there's an unsigned, unsent postcard of the labyrinth at Knossos. Anxiously, she ushers him out. Walking down from the apartment, the lift is broken. Wojciech fears his heart is going to give out. On the ground floor, it does. The sky spirals around him and he collapses into the street. When he wakes, he's in a hospital, Ava beside him. Joseph Matusek, the author of Under the Raven, worked for several decades as a homicide detective in Prague. And in his author photo, he looks with a barrel chest and olive green felt blazer, his thin hair greased down and back, more like a mid-level Soviet apparatchik than either a late existentialist or a playful postmodernist. He has a powerful, nut-cracking jaw. He sports the expressionless gaze of somebody who already knows what you will say, who even when you lie will know the truth behind your words. He achieved apparently brief celebrity in the last decade of the 20th century for solving the murder of a well-known industrialist with ties to Boris Yeltsin's fast-crumbling regime. His elusive, ironic interviews made him a favorite with the local papers. His colleagues, however, were quite surprised to learn that after he left them, woozy and exposed from drink, he returned to his apartment and wrote. And that when he wrote things that, for all their hard-boiled artifice, had about as much logical consistency as an over-easy egg. For example, take this Wojciech monologue, which sounds like a stand-in for his creator. Through my many years working as a detective, I've started to suspect that the difference between life and death is less absolute than a coroner is trying to perceive. There are living people who carry a bit of death along with them wherever they go. Not some inevitable final moment, but something that permeates their everyday, something contagious and gray, played by an out-of-tune violin. And the opposite is even more true. Dead people who continue to walk beside us in the evening, who materialize in the passing windows of trams and subways, who shake their heads slowly when we're false, who tug at our sleeves when we try to change. And some people, well, they drift so endlessly back and forth between the two, who can really tell? Eventually it came to a head when I was asked to solve a murder my colleagues insisted had happened just days or weeks ago, but which I was convinced had occurred years or even decades earlier. There's never any shortage of suspects. Once you start to think this way, we're all killers. Having crossed that line, I became very bad at my job, and my superiors decided it was best to make a change. So I'm going to leave the story hanging there, but that's the setup for the detective story. So as I was working on this book, I was reading a lot about both libraries and the history of books and publishing in particular. And there are two stories that surfaced that I think influenced this I wanted to share. One is about the Library of Alexandria. So this is, most of us have heard about this. This is the greatest library of the antique world. And it was an incredible place. It had at one point maybe 1 million scrolls. But the way it was assembled was by the Egyptians, the Ptolemies, who just decided they wanted to have the greatest collection of knowledge that existed in the world. And so they were extremely aggressive about this. And they started sending envoys out to Persia, to India, to Greece, to gather every known existing thing that had been written. And when people won't give it to them, they do their best to take it. And when ships are in the Mediterranean, they take over the ships and they steal any written material off the book. And this is how the library's created, because they want it all. But what's curious is that once you reveal what you really want, you also reveal your own weakness. And what happens as this community is out aggressively gathering books is they also accidentally spark an industry of forgeries. Because clever people start to realize that the Egyptians will pay virtually anything for written material. And so they start faking books. They start faking great Greek classical plays. And so the truth of the Library of Alexandria is it is the greatest collection of ancient times, but it's also a collection that's riddled with fake, false objects. And I love that about the library, that it is both those things simultaneously. And that was definitely one of the things I wanted this book to be. It's, if you read it, it's full of truth. There's a lot of facts and fictions that thread through it. But everything gets a little bit warped because it sits very close to fiction and a lot of lies right next to it. And hopefully you can't entirely tell where those things begin and where they stop. The other story that was really helpful for me was learning about Gutenberg and the invention of the press. So if you go back about 40 years before Gutenberg figures this out, so around 1400, in all of Europe, there are probably about 50,000 books in all of Europe. And that's not unique titles, that's physical books. I mean, it's almost nothing. If you go to a robust suburban Barnes & Noble, they typically will stock between 100,000 and 200,000 books, just for comparison. And a great independent shop like this is probably about 50,000 books. So this is more or less what existed in Europe, except for these are, probably 40,000 titles, whereas most of what was in Europe was copies of the Bible and different prayer books. So there's a period not that long ago when there was just it hardly even existed. It was so narrow and it could have gone away at any moment. And what Gutenberg does is kind of amazing, and of course it changes everything. All of the books start to get reproduced and distributed, and it changes culture entirely, and literacy expands, knowledge expands, everyone has access to it. But the other weird thing that happens is the meaning of books starts to change pretty quickly too. You go from a time when they are so rare that they really are sacred objects to a place in the future where they are mass-produced, and we have to figure out how do we discard them because we have so many. So it's sort of a wonderful arc that he puts in motion from rarity to abundance, and it's wonderful what happens, but it also, again, starts to sap books of some of their magic along the way. So the basic structure here is it's these 20 chapters, they're each a different imaginary book, but placed between each of those chapters is a brief little meditation about libraries. And these are all kind of drawn from what other people have imagined what libraries could possibly be. If any of you are familiar with Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, that was one of the inspirations for this book. And I kind of see these imaginary libraries a bit like his wonderful invisible cities that pop up in his mind. So I thought I'd share some of what people imagine libraries might possibly be. The South African writer, Ivan Vladislavich, imagined what he called a lost library, a kind of heavenly space preserved for a collection of perfect books that were never actually written. There are many reasons why. Because their authors, John Keats, Bruno Schultz, died too young or were swallowed up by monstrous events. Because their authors were discouraged before they even began. Because their authors squandered whatever talents they had and were unable to finish. Or because their authors spoke too much and wrote too little. Because these books were based upon the most astonishing, revealing dreams, and the dreams were all but forgotten upon waking. While the Lost Library gives these unwritten works to the world, its caveat is that none of the books can actually be touched or read. They're to remain permanently on the shelves, guarded by a beautiful and severe librarian. Quite a few science fiction writers have imagined ultimate libraries, collections that bring together every book ever written, or even in some cases, every book that ever will be written. More rigorously, the Argentine writer George Luis Borges imagined a rigidly geometric, nearly infinite library that contains every possible book created through the random combination of 23 letters and precisely 410 pages. They're mostly senseless, impenetrable tombs but just as a tiny speck of life ever so rarely manifests among billions of stars, so too an occasional work of literature assembles itself out of this scattering of letters, an odyssey, a divine comedy. The American writer, A.J. Hackworth, imagined a library that serves as a repository for as yet unwritten books. More specifically, for dangerous books its librarians are actively preventing from becoming written. Every so often, one of these embryonic ideas will escape into the world, at which point a librarian is assigned to retrieve this nascent threat before it can find an author and be brought to formidable life. One thing I like about these is the librarians are often less innocent or less wholesome. And we kind of pretend like librarians are. The Malaysian writer Yang Chu imagined a library of Heaven's Temple, hidden deep within Beijing's forbidden city. It's lined with volumes of every shape and size, from all across the world, and rich with rare and ancient manuscripts. Lost secrets, hidden truths abound. The challenge is entry, for only a select few are allowed within. One must prove oneself worthy of knowing. But how? The English writer, China Miéville, imagined a library of the nameless, comprised of a vast collection of dangerous and forbidden books, some bound in human skin, some cursed, some sentient. Were they to fall into the wrong hands, their occult knowledge might destroy the world, or just possibly enlighten it. Thus the library is hidden away and guarded by a team of formidable librarians, every bit as strange and threatening as the books they shelter. A couple more of these. The British writer, Claire Louise Bennett, imagined a vast, grandiose library built to satisfy the vast, grandiose ego of its patron. But on inspection, every page of every book was as blank as his soul. Actually, that's not quite correct. Although it appeared that every page of every book was as blank as his soul, he was promised that somewhere within this library there existed a single book that, within a single sentence, contained everything. If he could only find it, he would, at last, be fulfilled. Two more. The English artist Matt Haig imagined a midnight library that exists in a liminal space between life and death. Should you find yourself there, linger. Within its walls, vast but not endless, are books describing the various lives you might have led. On any given shelf or aisle, the books may seem rather repetitive, for not every choice is of grave consequence. But as you wander further into the far and poorly lit sections, you will be increasingly startled, sometimes relieved, sometimes at a loss, by what you might find. The last one. The Spanish writer, Carlos Ruiz Zafón, imagined a hidden library he called the Cemetery of Lost Books, an asylum for books that have lost or simply never found their readers. It's bound by mystical rules rather than the pragmatic ones of space management or supply and demand. Only special readers are allowed in. They can take just a single book. They must keep it forever. So, some of what was imagined. A couple other things I came across, again, while reading things for this book that just kind of blew my mind. So if you take that Gutenberg arc, 50,000 books in all of Europe, not that long ago. This year, 2024, in America, there will be close to 3 million unique books published in this country alone. It's kind of hard to get your head around. About 2/3 of those are self-published. Even so, they're published books. And if you imagine what happens in the future with AI writing more and more of those books, there will be more than 3 million next year, I'm sure. There's a ton of them, but the other side of the reality is that 96% will sell less than 1,000 copies. And another way of saying that is, a sweet little book like this, if it were to sell 1,000 copies, would outpace, 19 out of 20 books. But the reality is selling 1,000 books is really pretty rare in this world, and it's by no means guaranteed that this book will do that. And honestly, talking to my publishers, if this sold 2,000, it would kind of blow their minds. Which kind of blows your mind in two different directions, because that's so unbelievably nothing, right? We get so used to this world and volume and how quickly things amass. Books operate in a very different way. They just don't sell at all. And that part kind of, it's humbling, it's a little discouraging. But honestly, what was stranger to me than that low-level piece was the high-level piece is hardly any different. There was a court case that came out about a year ago when Penguin was basically being blocked from an additional merger. And what came out was a fair amount of details about the book business and how things work. But one of the details that was revealed is how, at what point publishers are offering different levels of author advances and what they sort of expect might happen. So at the level where they're offering authors a 250,000 book advance, so you're getting into like the serious higher level of what is out there. They're projecting that those are books that will sell between 25 and 75,000 copies, which is, yes, a lot more than 1 to 2,000, but also in the grand scheme of things, pretty close to zero. I mean, it's almost nothing still. And that's kind of books that are projected to be doing extremely well. It's kind of, again, I find it hard to get my head around the connection that we've got 2 million unique visitors doing producing media. That's almost nothing in any other. And really, the books that are selling, there's maybe 10 to 15 authors who consistently sell a ton of books. But everything else at the top is really by people you would fundamentally not think of first and foremost as writers. They're politicians, they're athletes, they're musicians. It's essentially a different way to monetize celebrity. So again, I don't quite know what to do with those two different facts, the ubiquity of books and the thinness of it. And the analogy or the metaphor that came to me when thinking about this was about the pedosphere, which is the layer of soil that encircles the earth. And what's weird about the pedosphere is it varies from about 3 inches to about 2 meters deep. In other words, like books, it's almost nothing. It's so thin, but it covers the earth. And basically all living life kind of grows out of that. But it's hardly there, and yet without it, nothing goes on. And that's sort of, I like that as an idea of how these books ultimately all fit together.
Yeah.
I'm going to read one last section, which is from the last book in this, and it's called A History of Book Burning, and it's by a woman named Lynn Pearson. Better put my glasses down. Perhaps a history of book burning caught my eye among the refuse of the discard room, because I'd recently reread an old story by the future director of Argentina's National Public Library about Qin Shi Huang, who, after bringing an end to a period known as the Warring Time by conquering all of his foes and reuniting China under his rule, famously, and perhaps apocryphally, ordered the construction of the Great Wall and the erasure of all written history within its confines. Protected from savages and the past, he was then free to initiate another grand project, directing all of the empire's sages and alchemists to concoct an elixir of life so that he could reign forever. It's likely that his early demise is linked to the consumption of their mercury-laced experiments. He was buried by his own decree within a city-sized mausoleum that flowed with poisoned rivers, eternally guarded by a 6,000-member terracotta army. Or maybe it was simply its glowing, glossy red and black cover, the bold yellow lettering that set it apart even in a poorly lit corner of the discard room. From the brief autobio at the back, I read that Pearson was a fellow librarian in a city that has long held a hazy fascination for me, after I spent a single night there half a lifetime ago, and I thought I might have fallen in love with my best friend's cousin. It was a time in life when falling in love was rather easy, in fact, problematically so. The reasons we pick up one book versus another are varied and bend to their own logic, and the reasons we write them too. In Pearson's case, She was in her first year at the library, fresh out of graduate school, when to her surprise, she was invited via word of mouth, there were no written details, by a colleague she hoped to befriend, to a book burning party. When she expressed alarm, she was laughed off. It's tradition, she was told, and fun. An annual event they hosted every August 22nd. Don't bring Fahrenheit 451, she was told. We've already done that. She was also warned not to mention the party to anyone else, because, for obvious reasons, the administration disapproved. In this cloak of silence, Pearson had no way of knowing who else among the staff had been invited, and whether this was a widespread event or a gathering of a select few. But over the days that followed, she felt there was a different hum about the lounge. Whispers in the aisles, winks across the arcade, a nervous anticipation of coordinated violation. She herself had been uncertain of what to do, both appalled by the theme of the party and, to her embarrassment, grateful. As a new employee, as a shy young woman living alone in a strange town, to have been welcomed into some kind of secret. When the evening eventually rolled around, she found her way to an unkept backyard, not far from the university campus, where maybe 30 or 40 of her peers had gathered, an odd assortment of the library's prized collection of misfits. The attendees had all been instructed to bring something to drink, that was essential, and something to burn. There was just a little coolness in the evening air, and the surviving mosquitoes had grown fat, sluggish, and increasingly bold in their attempts to pierce the soft flesh at the back of human necks, like lonely undergrads at the tail end of a party. It was an awkward sight at first, which might just be to say it was a gathering of librarians. But as evening finally gave way to dark and someone began feeding logs, not so much firewood really, but broken limbs and refuse gathered throughout the summer into the fire, it began to rage in a way that stirred something unexpected within Pearson. As the flames rose higher, popping red embers up into the sky and down onto the dark, dry grasses, the host, a low-ranking librarian, who often ran afoul of both the administration and the union, and who, in punishment, was continually moved from one branch or department to the next, began to speak by welcoming his guests and reminding them of the rules. Then he called them forward, one by one, and the librarians took their turns, standing before others and making the case for why the book they brought should be burned. So I'm going to pause there and let you imagine what actually happens when librarians get together for a book burning party.
Yeah.
And, it's not exactly what you think. I hope it's not what you think anyway. And I'd love to take some questions if you have any, but I wanted to share just one quick other odd story about discarded books and this strange reality books have of both disappearing and preserving themselves. So one of my sons was in this very shop, this is a true story, about a month ago, and he came across this book here, which curiously was written by his great uncle. No, his great great uncle, a long time ago, about his journey as a Missouri farm boy to eastern Poland in 1922, 23, 24, where he helped with agricultural restoration after World War I. Now, if there is ever a book that should be discarded, it is this book. The fact that this exists at all is unbelievable. I mean, there could never have been more than a few hundred copies of this. And somebody kept this for 60-odd years. Somebody brought it to Magers and Quinn. Somebody at Magers and Quinn thought somebody might actually get this. And yeah, it all happened. And so books disappear, and yet they don't totally disappear. They kind of resurface in bizarre ways. And the last funny detail about this book, because it all ties back to literature, is one of the characters in this book is Ilya Tolstoy, grandson of Leo, who, curiously, anybody know where he went to college? Penn College in Oskaloosa, Iowa, where he was sent by his Russian family to learn about agriculture, and even more bizarrely, where my grandfather, his great-great-grandfather, was his English tutor. So the world works in weird ways. Things surface and disappear, but they don't totally disappear. And that's my hope is, I'd love to sell 1,000 copies, but I'd love it in 60 years if somebody's grandkid or great nephew or whatever it is comes across this someplace. That would be a little pleasure too. So thank you all. I don't know if anybody has any questions. Young man in back.
So how did you catalog and keep track of all of your ideas? You have a big bunch of notepads in the shoebox.
I'm not very good at that. No, I don't know. I mean, a computer. I just write a lot. It's all there somewhere. I write very slowly. A lot of these stories have been bouncing around for years and years and years in different forms. I think it took me. A lot of them existed before I realized that they could be discarded books. And I think I finally found the form for this book, and then a lot of stories that had been bouncing around finally found their shape. And so, I don't know how I kept track of them. I think sadly I probably lost a bunch. Now that I think about it, I probably lost the best ones.
Yeah.
Oh well.
I have 100 questions about the book, and I'll keep texting you.
You might have to ask them loudly.
Sorry.
Or one of the, yeah. I'll repeat too.
I actually want to ask a question about your preamble to reading the book, and you related it to your experience at the library and this idea of being drawn to this discard room. Part of the book, I imagine, was trying to process why that was, that you were drawn to that. Did you get any answers? Is there something inherently attractive to the fact that they're condemned to the discard room? And if there's anything there,
Yeah.
you want to speak on that?
If you couldn't hear that, Sean, he was asking why the discard room? Why is that so appealing compared to other books? And I don't have a glib answer for it. I just think there's something wonderful about that kind of the oddity of these things that are imperfect, the flawed book that is still beautiful in its own way. That there is something particularly special about that, and also I think the joy of finding it. To be a hunter, to be a archivist, going through all that refuse and trying to discern what other people thought wasn't worthwhile, but that you see some value in it.
Yeah. To that point, there's a lot of flawed books on any shelf.
Yeah, most of this stuff will all be gone. I mean, that's the reality, right? In 20 years, it'll be the rare book in here that's still around. That's just how it is.
Every chapter is so beautifully written. Colin,
Yes.
are you?
Good question.
Oh, wait, there's more.
Oh.
Are you tempted to expand any of them into a novel length?
I occasionally think that way, but I think it just doesn't suit me. I've got a very short attention span. And I feel, honestly, I love the form that I've found. To try and write a full book in 10 pages and to make it feel as rich as a full book could take a lot less time. I don't know, I feel like if I can keep doing that, that feels exactly what I'd like to be doing.
Well, you mentioned Invisible Cities. The obvious question is about if on a winter's night a traveler, do these come to fruition at the end, or is this a constant source of frustration in the way that book is, where we never get to the end of one book before we're on to the next?
Yeah, it doesn't have that tight narrative. It's really set up at the beginning, but then there's not a flow through them, I don't think.
Gotcha.
Yes.
So, quick background analogy in a way. There was a day years ago when I tried to watch all the Oscar-nominated films in like one day, and had my schedule set up back to back. And I saw Children of Men, and I just stopped. Right, like I set my plan aside. And when I read the overstory, like I had to stop after each chapter because it was a jewel box, right? It was just it required that pause. And there were several of these stories that required me to pause afterwards. And I wondered if that was actually by design, because I realized you have to put these in some kind of order, right? So did you think about sort of the, I don't know, like music, you've got those pauses that are written in Was that on purpose?
Yeah, a little bit. You know, they are. I think they are very dense stories. They're again, what I was hoping to do is make them as rich as books. You know, that they are very brief, but they're not minimalist. They're maximalist. You know, everything is packed into a short space, and so I think sometimes you do not necessarily want two. You know, one is a lot. And I'd say a lot of them, honestly, I hope they're very funny, but a lot of them are pretty dark as well. And so I tried to just, you know, lighten the mood occasionally because,
Yeah.
you know, you only need so much of that, even though that's where I keep going.
A comment that the idea of the book that has 0 readers
Yeah,
is incredibly shocking and poignant. And the idea that your book mentions that is the macro possibility that
yeah.
it will have a reader.
Mm.
Or if that book is named, that particular book will have a reader.
Yeah.
And another comment that the library within the library reflects the play within the play, the story within the story. So I'm hearing as you're reading all sorts of nesting qualities that is very intriguing.
There's definitely, yeah, there's a lot of games being played about stacking it all up. And what does happen is, so the librarian starts to create his own library, which then other librarians start to borrow from, which kind of upsets him at first because it's kind of his own private little preserve. But then he's also kind of flattered that other people do. But then they kind of start screwing it up because they start doing the same thing and adding their version of what should be saved to it. And so it's these tensions between the secret thing you find, which you are grateful to have that little secret, and then you want to share it, and then it's no longer yours. We should probably stop in a minute or two, but this is fun. Yeah.
Books are always full of tough choices. Were there stories that didn't make it in? Books that didn't make it into the book?
Yeah, there are. There was probably about 4 or 5, not a huge number, but a handful that just at the end never felt that they quite worked. And there are a couple here that I think they do work, but I feel like I could never quite, I've been working on them for years, and they're short, and they still struggle with it. You never know if it's quite right. So yeah, definitely that they don't. Maybe they'll be the next book. Because that is my feeling about it. It's all material. It never goes away. It just doesn't work yet.
Yeah.
Maybe one more, and then maybe we're done. One more, and then let's talk about the wine, and we can talk differently. Yes.
So when you started, you talked about that Venn diagram, and so in a way, this is also about writing. And I wondered if you learned anything or thought about what it means to write a good book, and what that little sliver of not being good is about.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. I don't know how to answer that, to be honest. I guess I just love that space of, and I think, I'll tell you one thing that's funny about this book, and I say this humbly because, it's a small book, it won't go that far, but I haven't told anybody about this book who hasn't been like, wow, that's a great idea. Like, you just found something unique and strange, and that's interesting to people. And I've had a number of writers go, I could have done something better with that.
Yeah.
But I do think that notion of just things that are flawed and imperfect and yet are worthwhile and special, and they're kind of more special because they're flawed, that is there. And I do think that is true of art in lots of ways. Things that are too perfect, they're perfect, but who cares? And there's something more human that's available in lots of